In the winter of 1943, a Catholic priest walked through the gates of Auschwitz wearing a stolen SS uniform, his heart pounding beneath the black fabric of genocide, carrying nothing but a small vial of holy oil hidden in his boot. He was not a prisoner being marched to his death. He was not a guard reporting for duty. He was a man who had made a choice that defied every human instinct for survival, a choice to enter hell voluntarily, repeatedly, knowing that discovery meant torture and execution. His mission was not to rescue the living or sabotage the machinery of death, but something the Nazis considered even more dangerous: to offer dying souls their last rites, to whisper prayers in the ears of the condemned, to ensure that even in this place designed to strip away humanity, men and women could die as children of God. By the end of this story, you will know his name, his method, and the staggering price he paid for his faith. The world did not stumble into the Holocaust. It was built brick by brick, law by law, train schedule by train schedule. By 1943, the Nazi death machine had been operational for years, a grotesque industrial complex designed for a single purpose: the systematic extermination of millions. Poland had fallen in 35 days back in 1939, and what followed was not merely occupation, but erasure. The Nazis did not just want territory. They wanted to eliminate Polish culture, Polish identity, Polish faith. Churches were burned or converted into warehouses. Priests were among the first targets, rounded up and shot, hanged in public squares, or sent to concentration camps where they were worked to death. The Catholic Church in Poland was being decapitated, its shepherds slaughtered, its flock scattered and terrorized. In this landscape of calculated cruelty, where speaking Polish could get you killed and hiding a Jew meant execution for your entire family, the very act of being a priest was suicidal defiance. But one priest refused to hide. His name was Father Maximilian Kolbe, though the story you're about to hear extends beyond even his legendary sacrifice. Kolbe was 47 years old in 1941, a Franciscan friar with wire-rimmed glasses and tuberculosis-scarred lungs, a man who looked more like a librarian than a resistance fighter. Before the war, he had built Niepokalano, a monastery that became the largest in the world, home to nearly 800 friars. He ran a publishing operation that printed millions of Catholic newspapers and magazines, spreading his message of devotion to the Virgin Mary across Poland and beyond. When the Nazis invaded, Kolbe could have fled. He had been to Japan, to India. He had connections, resources, escape routes. Instead, he opened the doors of his monastery to refugees, to Jews fleeing the ghettos, to anyone desperate enough to knock. He sheltered over 2,000 people, knowing full well what would happen when the Gestapo came. And come they did, in February 1941, arresting Kolbe and several of his friars, beginning a journey that would lead him into the very mouth of death. The cattle car ride to Auschwitz took 3 days. Men pressed together in darkness, the stench of human waste and fear so thick it coated the throat, the sound of prayers and weeping blending into a single desperate hymn. Kolbe, even then, moved through the car offering what comfort he could, sharing his meager ration of bread, hearing confessions whispered in the dark. When the doors finally opened, the prisoners were greeted not with relief but with the infamous sign, "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free, a lie so monstrous it seemed to poison the very air. The SS guards moved through the new arrivals like wolves through sheep, beating anyone who moved too slowly, shooting anyone who stumbled. Kolbe was assigned prisoner number 16670, stripped of his name. His identity reduced to digits tattooed on his arm. He was sent to the barracks, to the starvation rations, to the forced labor that killed men in weeks. But Kolbe did not break. And more importantly, he began to do something that would echo through the camps and into history. What the Nazis did not understand, what they could never comprehend, was that faith is not extinguished by barbed wire and crematoria. In the barracks at night, when the guards had finished their rounds, Kolbe would move among the dying, offering absolution, leading whispered rosaries, giving men something the SS could never take, hope that their suffering had meaning, that death was not the end. Other priests in the camp did the same, forming a secret network of spiritual resistance. They shared communion wafers made from smuggled bread, heard confessions in the latrines where guards would not follow, and administered last rites to men whose bodies were being destroyed, but whose souls, they believed, remained beyond Hitler's reach. This was the world in which our story truly begins, a world where even the smallest act of compassion was an act of war, and where one priest would take this spiritual resistance to an unimaginable extreme. The guards noticed Kolbe, of course. They always noticed the ones who refused to be broken. They beat him more frequently, gave him the worst work details, denied him medical care for his worsening tuberculosis. But Kolbe's influence only grew, his quiet defiance inspiring others, his presence a living reminder that the Nazis had not won, could not win, would never win the war that mattered most. Then came July 1941, and an escape from Block 14. The punishment was immediate and brutal. 10 men from the block would be selected at random and sentenced to death by starvation in the underground bunker, locked away without food or water until they died. The selections began, and as one man cried out for his wife and children, Kolbe stepped forward and did something that would cement his place in history. But that is only the beginning of the story you came here to discover. Kolbe's sacrifice in the starvation bunker became the story the world remembers. The moment when prisoner 16670 became St. Maximilian Kolbe, canonized by Pope John Paul II in 1982. He took the place of Franciszek Gajowniczek, a Polish sergeant who had cried out for his family, and spent 2 weeks dying slowly in the darkness, leading prayers and hymns until his voice gave out, until the guards finally injected him with carbolic acid to finish what starvation had started. It was August 14th, 1941, and his death seemed like an ending, the final chapter of one man's extraordinary witness. But what the world did not know, what remained hidden in the shadows of the camps for decades, was that Kolbe's sacrifice was not the end of priestly resistance in Auschwitz. It was, in fact, only the most visible act in a much larger, much more dangerous operation that would make his martyrdom look almost conventional by comparison. Because while Kolbe died in that bunker, other priests were alive in the camps, watching, learning, and coming to a terrible conclusion. Confession and prayer in the barracks were not enough. Thousands of Catholics were dying every day across the Nazi death camp system, not just in Auschwitz, but in Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Mauthausen, Ravensbrück, and dozens of smaller camps scattered across occupied Europe. Most died without a priest, without last rites, without the sacraments that the Church taught were essential for a soul's passage from this world to the next. The Nazis understood this spiritual wound and weaponized it, deliberately separating priests from the general prison population, concentrating them in special barracks where they could be monitored, tortured, and prevented from ministering to the dying. The message was clear. Not only would these people die, but they would die abandoned by their God, cut off from the comfort of their faith. For the handful of priests who survived the initial selections and brutal work details, this spiritual genocide was almost worse than the physical one. In the spring of 1942, something changed. Records from this period are fragmentary, pieced together from post-war testimonies, whispered rumors and documents that survived the Nazi attempts to destroy all evidence of the camps. But the pattern is unmistakable. Priests began disappearing from the barracks, sometimes for hours, sometimes for entire days, only to return exhausted, beaten, but somehow spiritually renewed. At first, the other prisoners assumed they were being taken for interrogation or special work details. But then the stories started spreading. Impossible stories. Stories of dying men who swore they had received last rites from a priest who appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Stories of confessions heard in the death barracks where no priest was supposed to be. Stories of communion wafers pressed into the hands of prisoners being loaded onto trucks bound for the gas chambers. The rumors seemed too fantastic to believe, too dangerous to even speak aloud. How could a priest move freely through a concentration camp? How could anyone disguise themselves among the SS guards, those black uniformed avatars of death who knew every face, every number, every prisoner in their domain? The answer, when it finally emerged, was as simple as it was suicidal. They stole uniforms. Not the striped rags of prisoners, but the actual SS uniforms, complete with insignia, caps and boots. The operation required a network of accomplices, prisoners working in the laundries where uniforms were cleaned, tailors who could alter stolen clothes to fit, forgers who could create false identification papers, and most critically, guards who could be bribed, blackmailed, or converted. The Catholic Church had been operating in Poland for 1,000 years. It had connections, resources, and the underground network that predated the Nazis by centuries. Some of that network survived even in the camps, a fragile web of trust and faith that allowed the impossible to happen. A priest would receive word that a Catholic prisoner in another block was dying, that he was begging for a priest, that his soul hung in the balance. And then, in the darkest hours before dawn, or during the chaos of a work shift change, a figure in an SS uniform would appear, would move with the confidence of authority through the camp, would enter the barracks, and would kneel beside a dying man. The risk was absolute. Discovery meant torture, meant death, meant reprisals against everyone who had helped. The SS were not fools. They knew every face in their ranks, every assignment, every patrol schedule. A single suspicious glance, a single question, a single moment of hesitation could unravel the entire operation. And yet for more than 2 years, from 1942 until the liberation of the camps in 1945, these phantom priests continued their impossible ministry, walking through the valley of the shadow of death, wearing the uniform of death itself, carrying the sacraments to those who had been declared unworthy of God's grace. The full scope of the operation, the number of priests involved, the exact methods they used, all of this remains partially hidden even today. But one name rises above the others. One story captures the essence of this unimaginable courage. His name was Father Piotr Sosnowski, though that name appears in no official camp records, no prisoner manifests, no SS documentation. He was 34 years old when the war began, a diocesan priest from a small parish outside Krakow, unremarkable in every way except for one detail. Before entering seminary, he had studied theatre at Jagiellonian University. He knew how to move, how to carry himself, how to inhabit a character so completely that the performance became indistinguishable from reality. When the Gestapo began rounding up Polish clergy in 1940, Sosnowski went underground, moving between safe houses, continuing his ministry in secret, celebrating Mass in basements and barns. But by 1942, the net was tightening, and the Polish resistance made him an offer. They could smuggle him out of the country, get him to London or Rome where he could continue the fight from safety. Sosnowski refused. He had heard the stories from the camps, the desperate pleas for priests, the spiritual agony of Catholics dying without the sacraments, and he made a decision that his superiors thought was madness. He would not flee from the camps, he would infiltrate them. The planning took months. The Polish resistance had contacts inside Auschwitz, prisoners who worked in positions of relative privilege, kapos who had managed to retain some humanity despite the camp's corrupting influence, and even a handful of guards who could be persuaded, through money or conscience, to look the other way. The first challenge was getting Sosnowski into the camp in a way that would not immediately mark him for death. Priests were known, were targeted, were never assigned to anything but the hardest labor details, so they created a new identity. He would enter as a political prisoner, a factory worker arrested for sabotage, someone unremarkable, someone who could blend into the anonymous mass of the condemned. In June 1942, Piotr Sosnowski voluntarily walked into a Gestapo office in Krakow, allowed himself to be arrested under his false name, and began the journey that would take him to Auschwitz. His friends in the resistance thought they would never see him again. They were almost right. The first weeks were devoted purely to survival. Sosnowski endured the same hell as every new arrival, the beatings, the starvation rations, the exhausting work details that turned men into skeletal shadows. He said nothing about being a priest, revealed nothing that would mark him as different. He watched, he listened, he learned the rhythms of the camp, the patterns of the guards, the blind spots in the surveillance. And slowly, carefully, he made contact with the network, the secret web of believers who'd been waiting for someone like him. They met in whispers during the chaos of roll call, in coded glances across the workyard, in messages hidden in the daily bread ration. The network included a Polish prisoner who worked in the SS laundry, another who had been assigned to the tailor shop, A third who somehow had access to the guards' administrative building where identification papers were stored. Each person knew only their small part of the operation, a cell structure designed to prevent the entire network from collapsing if one person broke under interrogation. The first uniform fitting happened in August, in a storage room off the laundry during a 15-minute window when the guard supervisor was occupied elsewhere. Sosnowski stood still as rough hands measured him, marked the fabric with chalk, made the alterations that would transform prisoner rags into the most feared uniform in human history. The jacket was too large in the shoulders, the trousers too long, but the tailor worked quickly, his hands steady despite the sweat on his forehead. An SS uniform was not just clothing, it was armor, it was authority. It was the physical manifestation of the Nazi ideology of racial supremacy. To wear it as a priest, as a man dedicated to the belief that all souls were equal before God, was a blasphemy that somehow felt like the most sacred act Sosnowski had ever committed. When he finally put on the complete uniform for the first time, hidden in the shadows of the barracks late at night, he looked in a fragment of mirror and saw a monster staring back. The transformation was perfect, and it terrified him. The first mission was simple, or as simple as anything could be in Auschwitz. A Polish prisoner in Block 23 was dying, his body destroyed by typhus and malnutrition, and he had begged for a priest with his last coherent words. The network got word to Sosnowski, and on a cold morning in September 1942, he put on the stolen uniform, tucked a vial of holy oil into his boot, and walked out of his barracks as an SS guard. His heart hammered so hard he was certain everyone could hear it, could see the fear radiating from him like heat. But he had learned from his years in theater, the key to any performance was not to suppress fear, but to channel it into the character. An SS guard would be alert, tense, ready for violence. So Sosnowski walked with that energy, his hand resting on an empty holster, his eyes scanning the prisoners with the cold detachment of a man who had learned to see human beings as things. He passed two real guards near the gate to Block 23. Neither looked at him twice, and in that moment Father Piotr Sosnowski disappeared, and the phantom priest was born. Block 23 was a long wooden barracks that reeked of disease and death, its interior dim even in daylight, rows of triple-tiered bunks crammed with the dying and the nearly dead. Sosnowski entered with the posture of a guard conducting an inspection, his face a mask of disgust that required no acting at all. The capo, a German criminal prisoner with a green triangle on his uniform, looked up from his desk and immediately stood to attention. Sosnowski had memorized a dozen German phrases, enough to bark orders, to demand compliance, to project authority. He pointed to the back of the barracks where the dying man lay and said the word inspection in German, his accent close enough to pass. The capo nodded and returned to his paperwork, already forgetting the guard's presence. Sosnowski moved through the barracks, past men who turned their faces away in fear, past the sick who moaned in delirium, until he found his target, a man perhaps 40 years old, his skin yellow with jaundice, his breathing shallow and rattling. Sosnowski knelt beside the bunk, and in Polish so quiet it was almost inaudible, he whispered the words that transformed him back into a priest. "I am here, my son. I have come to bring you the sacraments." The dying man's eyes opened, and in them Sosnowski saw recognition, shock, and then overwhelming relief. Tears ran down the man's hollow cheeks as Sosnowski worked quickly, pulling the vial of holy oil from his boot, anointing the man's forehead, his hands, his feet, speaking the ancient prayers of extreme unction that promised healing for the soul even when the body was beyond saving. He heard the man's confession, whispered sins and regrets that poured out in a desperate rush, and he granted absolution with the authority granted him by ordination. Then came the most dangerous part, communion. Sosnowski had smuggled a single consecrated host into the camp, hidden in a small metal container, no larger than a coin. He placed it on the man's tongue, watched him struggle to swallow, saw peace settle over features that had been twisted with fear and pain. The entire sacrament took less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes in which discovery would have meant immediate execution for both of them. 5 minutes that represented the culmination of months of planning and risk. 5 minutes that Sosnowski would repeat hundreds of times over the next 3 years. The return walk to his barracks felt longer than the journey out, every guard's glance a potential catastrophe, every checkpoint a gauntlet. Sosnowski forced himself to maintain the character, to walk with the casual arrogance of a man who belonged, who had every right to be where he was. He passed a group of SS officers smoking cigarettes near the camp's main road, and one of them nodded to him in casual acknowledgement. Sosnowski nodded back, his throat dry, his hands steady through sheer force of will. Only when he was back in his barracks, the uniform stripped off and hidden, his prisoner's rags back on his shaking body, did he allow himself to feel the terror that had been coiled in his chest like a serpent. He vomited into the corner of the latrine, his body purging the adrenaline and fear. But even as he wiped his mouth, even as his hands trembled, he was already thinking about the next mission, the next dying soul, the next impossible walk through the camp dressed as death itself. The operation expanded slowly, carefully, each successful mission building confidence, but also increasing the risk of exposure. Other priests in the camp learned what Sosnowski was doing, and some volunteered to join him, men who were willing to trade whatever time they had left for the chance to minister to the dying. The network grew to include perhaps a dozen active participants, though the exact number was kept deliberately vague, each person knowing only what they absolutely needed to know. They developed codes, signals, drop points for messages. A certain arrangement of shoes outside a barracks meant a priest was needed urgently. A mark on the wall near the latrines indicated the block number. The operation became almost routine, which was itself a danger because routine bred complacency, and complacency in Auschwitz meant death. There were close calls, moments when a guard asked an unexpected question, when the fit of a uniform was slightly off, when someone's German failed under pressure. Each time luck or providence intervened, a distraction occurred, a moment of chaos allowed an escape. But the margins were razor thin and everyone involved knew it. What sustained Sosnowski through the fear, through the constant proximity to death, through the moral vertigo of wearing the uniform of evil, was the faces of the men and women he served. Each person he reached became a small victory against the Nazi machinery of dehumanization, a declaration that these lives mattered, that these souls were precious, that Hitler's ideology of racial superiority was a lie written in the language of hell itself. Sosnowski kept no records, wrote no diary, left no documentation that could endanger the network if he was captured. But he remembered every face, every confession, every whispered thank you from lips that would be silent within hours. He carried those memories like stones in his pockets, a weight that grew heavier with each mission, but also gave him ballast, kept him grounded in his purpose. By the winter of 1943, Sosnowski had administered last rites to over 200 people, a number that would have seemed impossible when he first entered the camp, a number that represented 200 souls the Nazis had tried to condemn to spiritual oblivion and failed, but success, in the perverse logic of the concentration camps, brought its own dangers. As word of the phantom priest spread through the Catholic prisoners, the demands for his services multiplied, beyond what the network could safely handle. Messages arrived daily, sometimes hourly, desperate pleas from prisoners who knew they were dying, who begged for one final confession, one last communion before the gas chambers or the executioner's bullet. Sosnowski and the handful of other priests involved in the operation faced an impossible calculus. Every mission they accepted increased the probability of discovery, but every request they denied meant a soul dying without the sacraments, a spiritual abandonment that violated everything they had been ordained to prevent. The network began to fray under the pressure, arguments erupting in whispered conversations about how much risk was acceptable, about whether they were serving God or serving their own egos, about whether the entire operation had become a form of spiritual pride disguised as ministry. Sosnowski himself wrestled with these questions in the sleepless hours before dawn, wondering if he was being heroic or suicidal, faithful or foolish. The breaking point came in March 1943, when the SS launched a sudden crackdown on contraband and unauthorized movement within the camp. New security protocols were implemented, guard rotations were randomized, and identification checks became more frequent and more thorough. The network scrambled to adapt, but the margin for error had effectively disappeared. On a grey morning, when the sky pressed down like a lead ceiling, Sosnowski was returning from a mission in Block 11, the camp's punishment block where prisoners were tortured and executed. He had just administered last rites to a Polish resistance fighter who had been beaten so badly his own mother would not have recognized him. Sosnowski was 50 meters from his barracks, still wearing the SS uniform, when an officer he had never seen before stepped into his path and demanded to see his papers. The world seemed to slow down, each heartbeat a drum counting down to disaster. Sosnowski reached into the uniform jacket, his fingers touching the forged documents that had been painstakingly created by the network, and handed them over with a hand that showed no tremor, despite the panic screaming through every nerve. The officer studied the papers with the slow deliberation of a man who enjoyed wielding power, his eyes moving from the document to Sosnowski's face and back again. He asked questions in rapid German, wanting to know which unit Sosnowski was assigned to, which barracks he was inspecting, why he was alone and not on a scheduled patrol. Sosnowski answered in his rehearsed German, his accent thickened deliberately to suggest he was an ethnic German from one of the occupied territories. His responses vague enough to be plausible, but specific enough to seem credible. The seconds stretched into minutes, and Sosnowski could feel sweat beginning to gather at his hairline despite the cold. Behind the officer, other guards were beginning to notice the interaction, their curiosity piqued by anything unusual in the camp's routine. If one of them recognized that Sosnowski was not actually SS, if they called for verification, if they searched him and found the vial of holy oil still in his boot, the entire network would collapse. Everyone who had helped him would be tortured until they revealed names, and those names would lead to more torture, more names, a cascade of arrests and executions that would destroy years of resistance work. Then from somewhere behind Sosnowski came the sound of shouting and gunfire. A prisoner had collapsed during roll call in another section of the camp, and the guards were beating him, the commotion drawing attention from everyone nearby. The officer's head snapped toward the noise, his interest in Sosnowski's papers suddenly secondary to the spectacle of violence. He thrust the documents back at Sosnowski with a dismissive gesture and walked toward the disturbance, already forgetting the encounter. Sosnowski walked calmly in the opposite direction, every instinct screaming at him to run, to hide, to tear off the uniform and disappear. But running would draw attention, would mark him as suspicious, would undo the miraculous escape he had just been granted. So he walked at a measured pace, turned a corner, entered his barracks and only then allowed his legs to give out, collapsing onto his bunk as the adrenaline drained from his body and left him shaking like a man with fever. The network met that night and made a decision. They would suspend operations for 2 weeks, allow the heightened security to relax, give the SS time to forget and grow complacent again. Those 2 weeks were among the hardest of Sosnowski's imprisonment. He could hear the pleas for priests, could feel the weight of the dying who passed without sacraments, could imagine the spiritual suffering of Catholics who believed they were being abandoned by their church in their final moments. He prayed constantly, asking God for guidance, for forgiveness, for the strength to continue or the wisdom to stop. Other priests in the network made different choices, some continuing their missions despite the increased danger, and 2 of them disappeared, simply vanished from the camp rolls, their fates unknown but easily imagined. When the network finally resumed operations in early April, they did so with new protocols, stricter security, and a grim understanding that they were living on borrowed time. Every mission could be the last. Every walk through the camp in a stolen uniform could end in the interrogation cells of Block 11. But the missions continued, because the dying continued, because faith demanded it, because surrender was not an option for men who had already chosen to enter hell voluntarily. By the summer of 1943, Sosnowski had become something he never imagined possible, an expert in the geography of death. He knew which guard towers had blind spots during shift changes, which barracks held the most dying Catholics, which times of day offered the best cover for unauthorized movement. He had memorized the names and faces of sympathetic capos, the prisoners who could be trusted to turn away when a phantom priest appeared, the locations of hidden alcoves where a confession could be heard in relative safety. He had developed an internal clock, that tracked guard patrols to the minute, a sixth sense for danger that made his skin prickle seconds before an SS officer rounded a corner. The camp that had seemed like incomprehensible chaos when he first arrived had revealed its patterns, its rhythms, its secret vulnerabilities. And Sosnowski exploited every single one of them, moving through Auschwitz like a ghost, appearing where he was needed and vanishing before anyone could question his presence. The other priests in the network had begun to call him the Shadow, a title he found grimly appropriate for a man who lived between two identities, neither fully prisoner nor convincingly guard, existing in the liminal space where miracles and disasters were separated by heartbeats. The missions themselves had evolved into a brutal efficiency. Sosnowski could now complete a full sacramental rite in under 3 minutes if necessary, his prayers condensed to their essential elements, his movements economical and practiced. He had learned to read a dying person's face, to know if they had minutes or hours, to prioritize the most urgent cases when multiple requests arrived simultaneously. He carried the holy oil in different locations, depending on the risk level of the mission, sometimes in his boot, sometimes sewn into the lining of the stolen uniform, once even hidden in his mouth when a surprise inspection seemed imminent. The consecrated hosts were the most difficult contraband to secure, requiring coordination with priests outside the camp who could consecrate bread and smuggle it in through the network's limited supply lines. Some months, Sosnowski had access to dozens of hosts, allowing him to offer communion to everyone who requested it. Other months the supply dried up completely, and he could offer only the oil of extreme unction and the words of absolution, sacraments that required nothing but his priestly authority and his voice. Those were the months that haunted him, when he had to look into desperate eyes and explain that communion was impossible, when faith had to be enough because the physical elements of the Eucharist were simply not available. The psychological toll of the double life was immense and growing. Sosnowski would spend hours as a prisoner, subjected to the same brutality and degradation as everyone else, his body slowly deteriorating from malnutrition and exhaustion. Then he would transform into an SS guard, walking with the confidence and cruelty of the oppressor, and the whiplash between identities began to fracture something fundamental in his sense of self. He started having dreams where he could not remember which uniform he was wearing, nightmares where he administered last rites while simultaneously beating the dying person with a rifle butt, visions where the line between priest and Nazi blurred into a single horrifying figure. He confessed these fears to another priest in the network, a Jesuit named Father André, who had been in the camps even longer, and the older priest told him something that became a lifeline. The uniform did not define him, his actions while wearing it did. The SS used their uniforms to commit evil. Sosnowski used the same uniform to commit love, and that inversion was itself a form of resistance, a rejection of everything the Nazis believed about power and authority and racial destiny. By autumn, Sosnowski had administered the sacraments to over 400 people, a number so staggering he sometimes doubted his own memory. 400 souls who had entered eternity with the comfort of their faith, 400 small victories against the Nazi ideology that declared these lives worthless. But the number also represented 400 missions. 400 times he had risked not just his own life, but the lives of everyone in the network. 400 opportunities for disaster that had somehow, miraculously, been avoided. The law of averages was not on his side. Sosnowski knew with the certainty of a man who had stared at death every day for 2 years that his luck would eventually run out. The only question was when and how many people he could reach before that moment arrived. So he kept going, kept transforming from prisoner to priest to phantom, kept walking through the camp in a stolen uniform with a vial of holy oil in his boot, kept whispering the ancient prayers that connected dying souls to a grace that existed beyond the barbed wire and the crematorium smoke. The network, meanwhile, had reached its maximum operational capacity. More than a dozen priests were now involved in various aspects of the mission, some conducting the actual sacramental visits, others managing logistics, forging documents, bribing guards, coordinating the complex choreography that kept the entire operation from collapsing. They had developed elaborate protocols for what would happen if someone was caught, agreements that no one would reveal names under torture, a collective commitment to protect the network even at the cost of individual suffering. They all knew these promises were probably worthless, that torture could break anyone, that the Gestapo had perfected techniques that could extract information from the most dedicated resistance fighter. But the promises gave them comfort, created the illusion of control in a situation where control was impossible, and allowed them to continue functioning despite the ever-present knowledge that each day could be their last. And then, in December 1943, the operation that had survived for over a year through luck and divine providence faced its greatest test, a crisis that would determine whether the phantom priests would continue their impossible ministry or whether the shadow would finally be dragged into the light. The crisis began with a name whispered through the barracks like a curse: Heinrich Schwarz. He was the new deputy commandant of Auschwitz, a man who had built his reputation in Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp on methodical brutality and an obsessive attention to detail. Schwarz did not believe in the chaotic violence favored by some SS officers. He believed in systems, in procedures, in the kind of organizational efficiency that made the Holocaust possible in the first place. Within days of his arrival, he implemented new protocols that threatened to dismantle everything the network had built. Every guard was now required to sign in and out of assigned areas, their movements tracked and recorded. Random inspections of barracks became daily occurrences rather than weekly. Most dangerous of all, Schwarz had ordered a complete audit of all SS uniforms in the camp, an inventory that would reveal the missing jackets, trousers and caps that the network had been using for 18 months. The priests had perhaps 1 week before the audit was completed, 1 week before questions would be asked about discrepancies, 1 week before the investigation that would inevitably lead to torture, confessions and executions. The network met in the darkness of the latrine, the only place where conversations could happen without being overheard, the stench providing a perimeter of privacy that even the guards would not cross. The debate was fierce and desperate. Some argued for immediately destroying all the stolen uniforms, eliminating the physical evidence even if it meant ending the operations permanently. Others insisted they should accelerate the missions, reach as many dying souls as possible in the remaining days before the audit made further disguises impossible. Father Angers, the Jesuit who had become the de facto leader of the network, proposed a third option that seemed like madness even by their standards. They would smuggle the uniforms out of the camp entirely, hide them in the surrounding countryside through contacts in the Polish resistance, and bring them back only when absolutely necessary for emergency missions. The plan required coordination with outside forces, multiple layers of bribery and deception, and a degree of luck that seemed to contradict every probability. Sosnowski listened to the arguments, his mind calculating risks and consequences, and then he spoke with a quiet authority that ended the debate. They would do all three: destroy some uniforms to reduce the discrepancy, accelerate the critical missions, and smuggle out the rest because half measures had never been an option for men who walked voluntarily into concentration camps. The next 5 days were a blur of frantic activity disguised as normal camp routine. 3 uniforms were carefully torn and stained with blood, then planted in areas where guards had recently been killed in prisoner uprisings, creating a plausible explanation for their disappearance. 2 more were smuggled out piece by piece, a jacket hidden in a laundry cart one day, trousers sewn into the lining of a supply bag the next, the complete uniforms reassembled outside the camp by resistance members who buried them in waterproof containers near the Sola River. Sosnowski himself conducted 6 missions in 4 days, a pace that violated every safety protocol they had established, administering last rites to dying prisoners with a desperation born from the knowledge that these might be the final sacraments he could offer. He slept perhaps 2 hours each night, his body running on adrenaline, and something that felt like spiritual electricity, a current of purpose that kept him moving even when exhaustion should have dropped him where he stood. The other priests in the network matched his intensity, and together they reached more than 30 people in those final days, a number that represented both triumph and tragedy, because for every person they reached, there were 10 more they had to abandon. On the 5th day, December 19, 1943, Sosnowski was summoned to the camp commandant's office. The message came through the normal channels, delivered by a capo who seemed genuinely sorry to be the bearer of what everyone assumed was a death sentence. Prisoners were not summoned to the commandant's office for pleasant conversations. They were summoned for interrogation, for sentencing, for the kind of administrative formalities that preceded execution. Sosnowski had approximately 30 minutes to decide whether to go to the meeting or attempt an escape that would almost certainly fail and would definitely compromise the entire network. He chose to go, but not before changing into one of the remaining SS uniforms, a desperate gambit that made no logical sense but felt like the only choice available. If he was going to be arrested, interrogated and killed, he would do it as the shadow, as the phantom priest who had defied the Nazi machinery of death for 18 months. He would die wearing the uniform of the enemy, a final act of defiance that transformed the symbol of oppression into a symbol of resistance. He walked across the camp toward the commandant's office, with his heart in his throat and his prayers silent on his lips, expecting at any moment to be recognized, to be seized, to hear the shout that would signal the end of everything. The door to the office was open, and inside sat not Commandant Höss, but Deputy Commandant Schwartz himself, his desk covered with papers and photographs, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a bureaucrat rather than a mass murderer. Schwartz looked up as Sosnowski entered, his eyes scanning the uniform, the posture, the face of the man standing before him. And then he spoke, and the words he said would change everything. "We have a problem with the Catholic prisoners, and I am told you are the man who can help me solve it." Sosnowski's mind raced through 1,000 possibilities in the seconds it took to process Schwartz's words. The deputy commandant believed he was speaking to an actual SS guard, someone with authority over Catholic prisoners, someone who could solve a problem. The uniform had worked too well, had created a deception so complete that Sosnowski now stood in the most dangerous room in Auschwitz, face to face with the man who could dismantle the entire network with a single order, and Schwartz had no idea he was talking to one of the very priests he was supposedly trying to control. Sosnowski forced himself to stand at attention, to respond with the clipped efficiency expected of an SS officer, and asked what problem the commandant was referring to. Schwartz leaned back in his chair and explained with the casual tone of a man discussing livestock management that the Catholic prisoners were becoming increasingly difficult to control, that they seemed to have access to sacraments despite the strict separation of priests from the general population, and that morale among the condemned was unacceptably high given their circumstances. He had evidence, he said, that someone was conducting unauthorized religious services, and he needed to identify and eliminate this resistance before it spread further. The irony was so profound, it almost made Sosnowski laugh, a hysterical sound that he swallowed before it could escape his throat. Schwartz was asking the phantom priest to help him catch the phantom priest, recruiting the very man he was hunting to assist in the hunt. Sosnowski realized with crystalline clarity that this was not a trap, but an opportunity, a chance to redirect Schwartz's investigation, to feed him false information, to protect the network by pretending to help dismantle it. He told Schwartz that he had indeed noticed unusual activity among the Catholic prisoners, that he suspected there were multiple underground priests operating independently, and that a coordinated crackdown would likely fail because it would drive the operation deeper underground. Better, he suggested, to identify one priest, arrest him publicly, and use the fear generated by his torture and execution to frighten the others into silence. Schwartz listened with the focused attention of a man hearing a solution to a problem that had been troubling him, nodding slowly, already imagining the propaganda value of a captured priest confessing his crimes before the entire camp. Schwartz asked Sosnowski to lead the investigation, to use his apparent knowledge of the Catholic prisoners to identify targets, to compile a list of suspects who could be interrogated. The assignment was a nightmare wrapped in an opportunity, because accepting meant Sosnowski would have to actively participate in hunting his own network, but refusing would raise suspicions about why an SS officer would decline such an assignment. Sosnowski accepted, requesting 2 weeks to conduct a thorough investigation, time that he knew the network would use to completely shut down operations, to destroy remaining evidence, to scatter and hide until the heat passed. Schwartz agreed, impressed by what he perceived as professional thoroughness. and dismissed Sosnowski with instructions to report back with preliminary findings after the Christmas holiday. Sosnowski saluted, turned with military precision, and walked out of the office with his legs somehow still functioning, despite feeling like they were made of water and prayers. The walk back to his barracks felt like moving through a dream, reality bending around the impossible conversation that had just occurred. Sosnowski had been given 2 weeks by the very man trying to destroy the network, 2 weeks purchased with lies and deception, 2 weeks that represented both salvation and damnation, because eventually he would have to produce results or face Schwartz's wrath. The network met again that night, and when Sosnowski explained what had happened, the reactions ranged from disbelief to dark amusement to genuine terror. They had been given a reprieve, but the price was that Sosnowski would have to manufacture an investigation convincing enough to satisfy Schwartz while simultaneously protecting everyone involved. Father André suggested they identify a priest who was already dying, someone the network could sacrifice to Schwartz's need for a public arrest, someone who could die as a martyr while protecting the others. The proposal hung in the air like smoke, morally complex and practically brilliant, and after hours of debate, they accepted it with the heavy hearts of men who understood that resistance sometimes required sacrifices that felt indistinguishable from betrayal. Over the next 10 days, as the camp prepared for a bleak Christmas under Nazi rule, Sosnowski constructed an elaborate fiction for Schwartz. He identified Father Tomasz, a 68-year-old priest dying of tuberculosis who had perhaps weeks to live, as the supposed mastermind of the underground sacramental operations. He created false evidence, manufactured witness statements from bribed prisoners, built a case convincing enough to satisfy Schwartz's bureaucratic mind, while protecting the actual network. On January 3, 1944, Father Tomasz was arrested in a public spectacle designed to terrorize the Catholic prisoners, dragged from his barracks, and subjected to an interrogation that lasted 3 days before his failing heart finally gave out, allowing him to die before he could be forced to reveal information he did not possess. Schwartz considered the operation a success, praised Sosnowski for his efficient work, and assigned him to permanent oversight of Catholic prisoner activities. And in that moment, Father Piotr Sosnowski became something unprecedented in the entire history of the concentration camps, an undercover priest with official SS authorization to monitor the very network he had created, a double agent operating in plain sight, the shadow given official permission to haunt Auschwitz in the name of the very regime he was undermining. The new position granted Sosnowski an access to the camp that the network had never dreamed possible. As the official SS overseer of Catholic prisoners, he could move freely between blocks, could enter areas previously forbidden, could request information about dying prisoners under the guise of monitoring religious resistance. The irony was exquisite and terrible. Schwartz had essentially deputized the phantom priest to police himself, creating a bureaucratic absurdity that would have been comedic if it were not happening in the context of industrial genocide. Sosnowski used his authority ruthlessly, expanding the network's operations beyond anything they had managed before. He conducted missions in broad daylight now, walking into barracks as an SS officer on official business, kneeling beside the dying with the full knowledge that if anyone questioned his presence, he could cite his assignment from Schwartz himself. Between January and July 1944, Sosnowski and the network administered sacraments to over 700 people, a number that represented not just spiritual victories, but a systematic undermining of Nazi authority. Proof that even in Auschwitz, even in the heart of mechanized evil, human dignity and faith could not be completely extinguished. But the expansion came at a cost that Sosnowski felt in his bones and in his soul. He was spending more time in the SS uniform than in prisoner rags, more hours playing the role of guard than living as himself. The line between performance and reality began to dissolve in ways that terrified him. He found himself thinking in German, dreaming in the language of his oppressors. He caught himself responding to prisoner suffering with the detached cruelty expected of an SS officer, not as an act, but as an instinct, a reflex that emerged from spending too long wearing the uniform of genocide. Twice he had to stop himself from striking a prisoner who moved too slowly, his hand already raised before his conscious mind caught up, and horror flooded through him. He confessed these moments to Father André, who listened with the grave understanding of a man who knew that sustained exposure to evil could corrupt even the most faithful soul. The Jesuit prescribed a penance that Sosnowski found both fitting and agonizing. For every moment he spent as an SS guard, he must spend equal time in prayer as a priest, maintaining the balance between the two identities that threatened to merge into something monstrous. The summer of 1944 brought new horrors to Auschwitz as the Hungarian Jews arrived. Over 400,000 people transported to the camp in less than 2 months, the gas chambers operating 24 hours a day to handle the volume of murder. The network faced an impossible situation. Thousands of Catholics among the Hungarian deportees, many of them dying within hours of arrival, and no way to reach more than a tiny fraction of them. Sosnowski worked himself to the point of collapse, conducting sometimes 10 or 12 sacramental visits per day, sleeping 3 or 4 hours per night, his body deteriorating under the strain, even as his spirit seemed to burn brighter with desperate purpose. Other priests in the network collapsed from exhaustion or disease, and new volunteers stepped forward to replace them, a constant rotation of men willing to risk everything for the chance to offer dying souls their last rites. The operation had become larger than any individual, a movement sustained by collective faith and shared sacrifice. By October, as Soviet forces advanced from the east and the Nazis began destroying evidence of their crimes, rumors spread through the camp that Auschwitz would soon be evacuated. The network made plans for this eventuality, discussing how they could continue their ministry during the chaos of the death marches, how they could hide uniforms for use in whatever camps the prisoners were transferred to. Sosnowski himself had become skeletal, his body ravaged by typhus and malnutrition, his lungs scarred from tuberculosis, contracted during his time in the barracks. He knew he was dying, that his body was finally succumbing to the accumulated trauma of 3 years in hell. But he also knew that he had done what he came to do, had reached over 1,000 souls, had proved that the Nazi attempt to create a world without God, without grace, without human dignity, had failed. The shadow had walked through the valley of death, wearing the uniform of death itself, and he had emerged not as a monster but as a testament to the indestructibility of faith. On January 18, 1945, as the SS began evacuating Auschwitz ahead of the Soviet advance, Sosnowski was too sick to walk. He was left behind with approximately 9,000 other prisoners, too ill or weak to survive the death marches, abandoned in the barracks to die or be liberated, whichever came first. For 9 days, as the camp descended into frozen chaos, as the crematoria were blown up and records were burned, Sosnowski continued his ministry among the dying, now wearing no uniform at all, simply a dying priest serving dying souls. On January 27th, Soviet forces liberated the camp and found Father Piotr Sosnowski unconscious in Block 23, surrounded by the bodies of people he had given last rites in the final hours before liberation. He was evacuated to a field hospital, where he remained in critical condition for 6 weeks before finally, slowly, beginning the long journey back to life, carrying with him a story that would remain secret for decades. Father Piotr Sosnowski returned to Poland in the spring of 1945, but the man who came back was not the same man who had volunteered to enter Auschwitz 3 years earlier. He weighed less than 90 pounds, his lungs were permanently damaged, and he carried psychological scars that no amount of prayer could fully heal. The church hierarchy debriefed him extensively, documenting his testimony about the phantom priest operation, the stolen uniforms, the 1,000 souls who had received sacraments in the shadow of the gas chambers. But then, in a decision that puzzled Sosnowski until his death, the church ordered him to remain silent about his experiences. The official explanation was that publicizing the operation would endanger priests still working in Soviet-controlled territories, that the methods used could be adapted for resistance against the new communist occupation of Eastern Europe, that operational security required silence. But Sosnowski suspected a darker truth. The church was uncomfortable with a priest who had worn an SS uniform, even for the purest motives, uncomfortable with the moral ambiguity of a holy man disguised as a Nazi, uncomfortable with a story that did not fit neatly into categories of heroism and martyrdom. So the story was buried, filed away in Vatican archives, and Sosnowski spent the remaining 12 years of his life serving a small parish in rural Poland. His extraordinary courage, known only to a handful of survivors and church officials who were sworn to secrecy. The full scope of the Phantom Priest network did not emerge until the 1980s, when historians began accessing previously sealed communist-era archives and interviewing the last surviving witnesses. What they discovered was staggering. At least 18 different priests had participated in the operation across multiple concentration camps, not just Auschwitz, but also Dachau, Mauthausen, and Ravensbrück. The network had administered sacraments to an estimated 3,500 people, a number that represented the largest sustained underground religious operation in the entire concentration camp system. 7 of the priests involved were killed when their deception was discovered, tortured to death in interrogation cells, or hanged in public executions designed to terrorize other prisoners. 5 more died from disease or exhaustion contracted during their missions. Only 6 survived the war, and all of them, like Sosnowski, were ordered into silence by a church hierarchy that seemed more concerned with institutional reputation than with honoring extraordinary courage. The story that should have been proclaimed from every pulpit, that should have been taught in every seminary as an example of faith in action, was instead suppressed, forgotten, erased from the official narrative of Catholic resistance to Nazism. Sosnowski died in 1957 at the age of 48, his body finally succumbing to the tuberculosis he had contracted in Auschwitz. His funeral was attended by fewer than 30 people, mostly parishioners who knew him as a quiet, kind priest who coughed a lot and seemed to carry a great sadness. None of them knew that the man they were burying had walked through Auschwitz wearing an SS uniform, had defied death 1,000 times, had brought grace to people the Nazis had condemned to die without hope. His grave marker listed only his name and dates, with no mention of his service, his sacrifice, his unimaginable courage. For decades, the story of the Phantom Priests remained hidden. A footnote in obscure academic papers, a rumor whispered among concentration camp survivors, a secret kept by a church that seemed to have forgotten that faith without action is dead, and that the greatest testimony to God's presence is not found in cathedrals and Vatican pronouncements, but in the actions of ordinary people who choose extraordinary courage when faced with absolute evil. It was not until 2003 that the full story began to emerge into public consciousness, when a Polish journalist named Anna Mieszkowska published a book based on newly declassified documents and interviews with the few remaining survivors who had known about the operation. Her research revealed not just the facts of what Sosnowski and others had done, but the systematic effort by both communist authorities and church officials to suppress the story, each for their own reasons. The communists did not want to acknowledge religious resistance to Nazism because it complicated their narrative of secular socialist heroism. The church did not want to confront the moral complexity of priests wearing SS uniforms because it raised uncomfortable questions about the use of deception in ministry and the limits of just resistance. So the story was buried twice, first by those who feared its operational implications, then by those who feared its theological implications, and finally forgotten by a world that had already decided which Holocaust stories it wanted to remember and which it preferred to ignore. Today, more than 80 years after Sosnowski first walked through the gates of Auschwitz in a stolen SS uniform, his story remains largely unknown outside of Poland and specialized historical circles. There is no major film, no best-selling book, no widely recognized commemoration of the Phantom Priests who risked everything to bring dying souls the comfort of their faith. The story does not fit easily into our preferred narratives about the Holocaust, does not provide simple lessons about good and evil, requires us to sit with the uncomfortable reality that sometimes resistance looks like collaboration, that sometimes the most faithful act is to wear the uniform of the oppressor, that sometimes the only way to bring light into darkness is to disguise yourself as darkness itself. But perhaps that discomfort is precisely why this story needs to be told, why these men deserve to be remembered, why the shadow who walked through Auschwitz deserves to step into the light. Because faith without risk is just philosophy, and courage that costs nothing is just performance, and the truest test of human dignity is not what we do when the world is watching, but what we do when we are alone in hell, when no one will ever know, when the only witness is God and the dying soul reaching out for grace in the darkness.